Alright guys, welcome to another video on private pilot training in FSX with Burner. And in this video I'd just like to talk about pattern work as well as a normal approach to landing. So right now we're taking off. This is actually a recording, and you can do your own recordings on FS Recorder. The only thing is with the A2A, it actually does not record the engine as well as the flap setting, so it'll be a little bit awkward if you're replaying certain things. Okay, so in the first two videos we actually did the entire pre-flight check, then we demonstrated a normal takeoff, and now we're going to talk about pattern work. A pattern is basically a rectangular course, typically around an airport, and as you can tell, the first heading where we took off is 36, and that is northbound. So we're doing a left turn to the west, and they're 90 degrees apart. They're not 90-degree turns, or they're 90 degrees apart, and they actually just make a big rectangle. So you can see we took off in that direction. And you don't want to extend. This is called your crosswind here. Now we're turning onto downwind. You don't want to extend that too much. Typically the traffic pattern altitude is done at 1,000 feet above ground, so my field is roughly about 1,050 feet or so. I'm sorry, 1,150 feet. And so the traffic pattern altitude here is done at 2,200. It's not always the case. You always want to check the airport and facility directory to make sure that you're flying at the right traffic pattern altitude, because it could be lower, it could be higher, depending on the situation. So right now, typically on your downwind, you bring the power back to 2,000 RPM, and you can see the RPM indicator down there, and that'll give you a steady about 80 knots or so. Just straight and level. If you're light, you're going to get a little faster. If you're heavy, it's going to be a little slower, but right about 80 knots or so. And then a beam is we actually passed it, so I'll rewind here. Okay, so your beam position is right there when you're directly looking at the numbers, and what you would do there is bring the power back to about 1,500 RPM is always the general rule, and then you'd extend 10 degrees of flaps with your first notch. There's 3 notches of flaps in the Cessna 172R. They used to be 40 degrees in other earlier models, and in fact the aircraft that I fly still has 40, or I think it might even be 45 degrees. But they found that it was causing too slow of airspeeds, and Cessna really didn't like pilots approaching that slow, so they kind of refitted them with a maximum of 30 degrees. Okay, so typically you want to start descending in your 1400. First notch of flaps is out, and if you have a carbureted engine, you throw the carb heat on, but since this is fuel injected, we don't have to worry about that. It's just when you get in the lower power settings, you might be susceptible to a little icing in the carburetor. Big power changes sometimes tend to cause icing. So here we are at our third turn, and this is called the base leg. You always want to check final to make sure nobody's coming, and our heading is eastbound, and then we'll make one final turn to the left to the north, right about here. And you always want to do about 30 degrees or less, maybe 20 degrees. One instructor always recommended I do 20, but 30 is not too aggressive, as long as you don't overuse the rudder. There's a lot of stall spin accidents on the base to final turn, and the reason is that they're using way too much rudder, and they're actually causing a stall spin accident at low altitude. So you want to avoid that by, if you overshoot the runway, you just want to use aileron. You don't want to use rudders. Okay, so at this point, you typically want to be about 500 feet AGL on final. That's a good kind of rule of thumb. And I brought it the second notch on base, and now I'm brought out the last notch of flaps, and I apologize again for the recorder not capturing that. And your speed should be anywhere between really 65, instructors will say that, but Cessna Pilot Operating Handbook recommends 55 to 65. So you can be anywhere between 60 and 65. As you come closer, when you know you're going to make the field, go ahead and idle the power, and you're going to bring the nose up. In the Cessna, a good reference is just having the tip of the cowling touch the horizon. Just try to get the tip of the cowling, depending on seating position, of course, to touch the horizon. So you just keep bringing it up until you're trying to grab that horizon all the way. And the elevator's all the way up at this point when you touch down, and then the nose wheel will slowly come down. And you want to maintain run rate, center line using your rudder pedals. So let's look at that approach again, and I'll talk a little bit more in detail about what I'm looking at and how to shoot a good approach. Okay, so again, this is the turn from base to final right now, and what we're looking for in a good approach is we're going to pick a spot on the runway, and typically I'll pick either those first markers there or the numbers. Okay, landing on the numbers, a lot of pilots strive to do that, but depending on obstructions and things like that, you don't really have to shoot for the numbers. You can shoot for the first marker there, and this is a long runway, so there's really no need to come in short. So as you pick one spot on the runway, you want to keep it in the same spot. Let's say you're picking the 3 and the 6 runway numbers as your reference. If the runway numbers start to move up, you know you're getting low. If they start to move down, you know you're getting high. And you're kind of looking for this kind of sight picture. I'll go ahead and back up here a little bit. Let me pause it for a sec. Okay, so those lights on the left side are called VOSI lights, and they are an indicator of whether you're on glide slope or not. If red over white, you're all right. Red over red, you're nearly dead. White over white, you're high as a kite. So that's the way you remember that. And right now we're on perfect glide slope for those middle markers, that is. Not for the numbers, for the middle markers, which are those blocks right there. Okay, so an important thing to remember is this is what a proper sight picture looks, and sometimes it just takes experience. If the runway starts to widen wider than this, you know that you're low, and you'll get a red over red indication. If the runway starts to narrow out and kind of thin out like a pencil or something, then you're too high, and you'll get that white over white indication. Okay. As we get closer, you will notice that that'll change to red over red, and that's just because we're getting below the glide slope, because we're aiming to for a point that's a little bit earlier than those 2 markers right there. That's typically what jets will use when they land. Smaller aircraft, we can use the numbers and kind of touch down in this first third of the runway here. Okay, so airspeed is absolutely crucial, and Cessnas love to float, so you do want to maintain as a safety margin 65. Instructors will always tell you that. As you get more experience, you'll actually come in a little bit slower on final. You could be between 60 and 65, and the Pilot Operating Handbook actually allows you up to 55 knots. If you have wind, you don't want to come in slow. You want to give yourself a little bit more airspeed, so that you can kind of cut through the air a little bit better. So main things is, you can use full flaps. Just depending on how you're taught. Some instructors always want you to use full flaps, but the Pilot Operating Handbook of the Cessna actually says to use the minimum allowable flaps to safely land on a runway. And that means, and if that means you're landing on a 10,000 foot runway and you can land with 0 flaps, you can absolutely do that. Some instructors will actually tell you to use 20 degrees of flaps, and the reason is that it will give you a more shallow approach. When you're using full flaps in this aircraft, you can really get a super steep approach, and I think you're hitting like 1,000 foot per minute descent rate or even more. And so there's a huge transition. Now the transition is between the normal approach to landing and bringing the nose up to flare. For those of you that don't know, flare simply is increasing the angle of attack or bringing the nose up as you near the runway, and when you're about a wingspan away from the runway, which is the entire length of the wing, both sides, so that's the wingspan, that's when you start entering ground effect. So when you're in that ground effect, you want to start bringing the nose up slowly and gradually until you're at the proper angle of attack for landing. A good rule of thumb is whatever angle you use for takeoff is going to be a decent angle for landing. In the Cessna Skyhawk, I typically use right around 7 to 10 degrees, which is kind of right in the middle here. And that's kind of a good thing to shoot for, but you're really not looking at the instrument, you're looking outside at the horizon. And another rule of thumb, which I mentioned earlier, was if you can get the cowling of the aircraft, which is the cover over the engine, to try to touch the horizon, it'll give you a good flare in this aircraft. And you actually do want to touch down with maximum elevator deflection. So I'll try to kind of demonstrate that. Now the controls are not working in this replay, so I'll just try to mimic what it would look like. So here you kind of level out, and notice how things kind of settle for a second as the aircraft bleeds speed. Then you want to continue to pull up and bring the nose up until the cowling is almost touching the horizon. Just keep pulling it up gradually. And you want to maintain full back pressure. Now in the real aircraft, my seating position is a little bit high, but in the real aircraft, depending on your seating position, I typically will see the tip of that cowling just touch the horizon, and I know that I have a good flare. So I'll go ahead and rewind this a little bit so we can see it again. Okay, so you're looking outside, and you're not really thinking about too much about airspeed right now. Once you've made the runway, you want to go ahead and idle the power. And there's a level out. So right here, you level out, and you just kind of hover over the runway. And then you continue to bring the nose up, bring the nose up, bring the nose up to kill your descent rate. Bring the nose up until you're full back pressure. So right here, I'm full back pressure, and you see that nose wheel is nice and up. Full back pressure, and the nose wheel gently comes down. And you still maintain that back pressure. You can see the elevator full up here all the way throughout the landing, because that gives you maximum aerodynamic braking and helps the aircraft slow down. Okay, so we'll see it one more time from the outside just for cinematic effect. And I got some cool views set up here with Easy Dock. So we'll play it from this angle. And one thing I just want you to pay attention to is that you do want the mains to touch down before the front tire. And it's all about timing. Keep bringing that nose up, and you'll see those mains touch first. And full back pressure. And keep that nose wheel off the ground as long as possible. And then you hit brakes as needed, which right here I'm hitting brakes. Okay, so that was a basic introduction to a normal landing. Of course, every aircraft is different, and you should consult the individual pilot operating handbook. I do want to emphasize, I'm not an instructor. This is for flight sim purposes, and it does have some real-life applications, obviously. However, this is not meant for necessarily for real-life instruction. I do use what I've learned in flying the real 172, and these lessons, I just want to bring some realism to your